Let the word go forth.
Fool me once.
Are you fired up?
I'm not a crook.
Are you ready to go?
Shame on you.
It's Abe Lincoln's Top Hat, hosted by Ben Kissel.
Fool me, can't get fooled again.
Hey, what's up, everyone? How you doing? Ben Kissel here. Thank you so much for listening to the show. Of course, we remember our good friend Kevin Barnett, and reminds us to hug our friends and love our friends, because you never know when you won't be able to see them again. So make sure you take an opportunity to talk to the ones you love. All right, with me today, I am just honored to have her with me. She is a multiple-time documentarian. She's written multiple books. She's been featured on multiple websites even. Everything's in multiples. And her most recent documentary, which you must go see immediately. I know here in New York City, it's playing at IFC. Check that out on Avenue of Americas. Astra Taylor is with us. The new documentary is What is Democracy? And I guess, has there ever been a more appropriate time for a documentary entitled What is Democracy?
I know. I still kind of get a thrill like hearing you say that, like her new documentary, and then it's this incredibly nerdy title. But I have to say that makes me happy. It's like the moment I can just be like, there's like a subset of people who are like, yeah, and then everyone else is like, huh? But you know, it's probably the best possible moment that a film with that title could come out. It's funny because I wrote the first email pitching it to my producer in 2013 when it was definitely less of a sort of easy case to make.
Right.
Most people, but the timing is right. People are thinking about democracy, and that's what this film is about. It's an invitation to think.
Well, absolutely they are, and I think that's always for the better. One of the unintended consequences of the recent political events, specifically in 2016, was that it motivated a lot of people. And I know that you have a history of being politically motivated, specifically when it comes to the Occupy Wall Street movement. You were pretty hands-on regarding that. What are you seeing right now as far as people taking proactive steps to, first of all, maybe answer the question, what is democracy? And second of all, how are they being proactive in preserving democracy? Oh, and and maybe we can even go way back and just, what is your idea of what democracy is? Yeah,
I mean, part of why I started working on this film and why I was thinking about it in 2016 was my experience in Occupy. And, Occupy, I think, was really interesting in the sense that it was a critical moment. The Obama presidency is happening, and yet there are, still social problems. The banks got bailed out, inequality was rising. And, I think it put this kind of class consciousness on the radar and was really important in terms of, naming the 1%. But it was a movement that refused to make demands. It was just what it was.
Right.
And, and there was an idea of direct democracy. So this idea of, assembly, everybody could join, and a lot of, pointing out what was flawed with the political system and the way that we don't have democracy. But for me, there was a disconnect in terms of, what actually having democracy would mean, how we would democratize the economy. What sort of like, okay, we know what we're against. What are we for? And this model of an assembly anyone can join is just totally untenable.
Right.
So we would march down the street and chant, "This is what democracy looks like," and I would be like, "I hope, yes, I hope, but I hope it also looks like a lot more than this." And so, it was I think it was a really, critical moment. And what we're seeing now, I think, of course, there is a certain person who is the president. He's not the subject of my film. He sort of comes in briefly, actually more as an example of the kind of demagogue that even Plato warned of years ago. But this moment has, I think you're exactly right, inspired a lot of people who were complacent, or maybe tuned out, or just did their duty and voted, but didn't do much more to reassess and think more deeply. So I see a lot of things to worry about, but I see a lot of things that really interest me. I mean, I think youth activism, like, kids who are not old enough to vote, are striking for the climate, pushing back on gun violence, and
yeah, absolutely.
People who are profiting from making weapons. I think we see strikes. I mean, look at the sort of new sense that labor is powerful. So we have and we also, of course, have a new generation of candidates who are diverse in the Democratic Party. So what's really interesting is like the sense of democracy is something that's inside and outside. You know, it's yes, voting and running for office and paying attention to what's happening in Washington, D.C. or your Capitol building in your state, or it's also the sense like we need to build power at the grassroots, and we need to also pay attention to how you build economic leverage for working people, and that's through things like unions and being conscious of ourselves as workers, it's really interesting. Trump tried to shut down the government, right?
Right.
But what he did was he didn't pay people. It was actually the threat that workers were not going to work. Those are the people who actually have the power to shut things down.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's a worrying but also really interesting time, and the film tries to have that, doesn't give false hope. It's like, yeah, things are hard. It's always been hard. Democracy is not easy, but people, it's also, something that has managed to advance and progress. And, it progresses through struggle. And so here we are.
Absolutely. And, when it comes to the government shutdown, what we saw, 35 days just ended this past Friday with legislation that literally was the same legislation that Donald Trump said no, he vetoed, or he wouldn't look at it a day before the shutdown. And it's just, more evidence that this was nothing but a political stunt on the backs of 800,000 federal workers who keep our planes in the air, which I am quite fond of as someone who flies, and I know that you do too. I like when the planes take off, and I love it when they land.
Yeah, it was probably you close LaGuardia for a couple hours, and a bunch of rich people are extra pissed,
Yep. So you talk about, it's interesting. Obviously, we're talking a lot about economics when it comes to Elizabeth Warren has her sort of 1% tax plan, a tax of 1% or 3% on people making $10 million bucks or more, $50 billion, to sort of peel away a little bit of the excess wealth from certain groups of people. But when it comes to the working class people of this country, that's one kind of angle, a tax on the wealthy. But when it comes to job creation and when it comes to what the future looks like, I know you wrote one of your writings was called The Faux Bot Revolution, a field guide to the future of work. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what is the future of work for people in this country. Is basically a UBI, a universal basic income, is that going to be one of the last options when it comes to people and automation and just getting jobs in general?
Okay, wow, yeah. So I have this other, I have this other trajectory. I make documentaries that tend to have a very philosophical bent. So, this film is about democracy, but it's in a philosophical mode. And what is democracy? What does it mean for the people to rule? Who are the people? How do we rule? Where do we rule? And it takes a very long time horizon. So it's global in its scope geographically, but then it also travels across millennia. So, but one thing that's really absent from the film, and this is on purpose, is the question of technology, because I don't see technology and, especially social media as a sort of driver of our democratic decline, as kind of a lot of people are implying these days about fake news or misinformation, right? I see social media is sort of symptomatic. And I wrote a book in 2014 called The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in a Digital Age, that makes the argument that the pathologies of our digital media and technology in general are actually, they're the problems that have been with us all along. So questions of economics. So, what's happening online and social media, why is there fake news online? Well, because people click on it. And it's got a media system that is driven by clicks and data collection. And so, it's how the economic incentives are aligned. So after writing a lot about the internet and, and technology, I've sort of expanded out. And I wrote this piece. There's a longer version of it actually in a magazine called Logic that is this really wonderful new tech magazine. And that one's called The Automation Charade. And it's I have to say, it's probably the most popular thing I've written. And I was like, wanting people to go watch my films, and then this article sort of went everywhere, and it resonated with sort of everybody from engineers and programmers to people who run unions, to users of technology. And my argument is basically in that piece is that, we hear a lot about automation, and automation is real. We know that, machine learning is powerful, and we know that many tasks are being done by machines when they were previously done by humans. But that there's actually a lot of stuff that's called automation that is not automated. And so what I say is it's photomated, F-A-U-X, so it's fake automation. There's actually a lot of work being done to create the facade of automation, to create the appearance of robots doing work or an interface doing work when actually it's just sort of humans behind the machine. So,
right.
So one example is when we check our own luggage in at the airport, or when we, ring up our own groceries. Like, that's not really automation. That's just that I'm being the grocery store checkout person, right?
Right. Oh yeah, I'm onto that trick.
Yeah.
I was onto that trick as soon as it started happening. I was like, you guys just made me another high school employee.
Exactly. And so that, I'm like, we shouldn't dignify that with the term automation, because that's actually, all that is companies trying to, boost their profits by getting rid of workers and having customers do the work for free. And
right.
then there are cases where, so there are more people cleaning up the internet, right? Like, making sure that it's not just totally horrifying. Let's post it on there. There are more people doing that work for Google and Facebook, but through contractors. When they work in the Philippines, they work in India, then there are actual employees of Facebook and Google and these big tech companies. So it's like, and we are given this facade that it's just like, it just happens like magic. So there's all this invisible work. So I think automation is both a reality, but it's also an ideology. And so when the powerful promote this idea that there's going to be a robot revolution, or the robots are taking our jobs, as though robots have agency. My point is that no, owners are investing. They're making targeted investments in technology that de-skills work, that speeds work up, that dehumanizes work, and that extracts more profit. And we need to be very critical and not just buy into this hype that's inevitable, right? Because there's lots of meaningful, important work that could be done. And, the question is, how do we manage our economy? There's not some inevitability. And so it's the same sort of thing. Robots are taking our jobs, immigrants are taking our jobs. And what this does is it creates fear. It creates a sense of powerlessness, as though these are natural forces when they're not, right?
Right.
These are all political decisions, and it's about power. It's not about, something that's just happening, right? And so therefore, we're like Luddites if we resist.
Well, absolutely. And maybe you can give me some more insight on this, of sort of like scapegoats. And obviously, I think, you make a great point regarding automation, and as if these robots have agency and they're coming in and legitimately taking our jobs, as opposed to what you just said, which is basically human-run corporations cutting costs and finding ways to get people to do more work for themselves with this guise of automation. And now we have Donald Trump, and of course, immigration is a cornerstone of his political base. Anti-immigration, specifically anti-Hispanic, Spanish-speaking immigrants. What's the history of sort of scapegoating different groups of people or automation? Has this just been happening in every civilization, in any so-called democracy?
I think it's hard to generalize. I mean, it is a recurring trend, but I also don't want to overplay it. So I just finished a book. I have a companion book that's coming out, companion book to the film, and it's called "Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone."
Right.
And this book is coming out May 7th, and there's a chapter that deals with the question of, democracy and exclusion. And I look at the history of xenophobia in the world democracies. And one thing I say some statistics, and the truth is that approval ratings for immigration are at an all-time high. I mean, there's recent polls show that actually the attention on the border, all right, and the anti-immigrant rhetoric that Trump has been promoting has actually caused people to be more negative towards the idea of the border. People like the idea of a wall, to separate the United States and Mexico more when Obama was the president. They like it less now. So I think it's really important that we not exaggerate how popular xenophobia is.
Right.
And I think we have to also understand how it has been specifically cultivated, because it serves interests, and it serves two people's interests. One, it serves the interests of employers who do like to pit domestic workers against foreign workers who are more vulnerable, right? Because they don't have the same rights, they can be paid less.
Right.
And it also, it also benefits the people who are involved in, getting contracts to build not just the walls, but also the surveillance apparatus, right? And to get contracts policing the border or setting up immigration detention centers.
Right.
And so those numbers, human beings, I think we have a hard time counting sometimes. I mean, if you look at the refugee crisis, or so-called refugee crisis in Greece going back to 2015, so 1 million people arrived at the shores of Greece and Italy through the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea. And that can sound like a lot. If your business depends on you making that number sound scary, that's 1 million people.
Right.
If you put that in context and go, well, hold on, this is actually a continent of 500 million people, right?
Right.
In the scheme of things, this is completely manageable. Then it changes the way that number resonates. And so I think one person in my film actually has this line, and he says, who counts, who gets counted? And I think we really have to think about that, right? Who is doing the counting? What is their agenda? Why
Right.
do they want a number to sound high and sound scary?
Right.
What?
No, absolutely.
But you're right. It totally goes back. It is, there have been histories. I'm in Canada now. I'm a Canadian citizen, and if you look at the history of Canadian democracy, what is troubling for democracy and for self-government is that actually, when Canada was connected to the British Empire, the British Empire was imperialist, so it had colonies all over the world, and so Canada actually became much more xenophobic and had tougher racist immigration laws when it became a democracy.
Interesting.
Right? Than when it was part of this imperial endeavor, which was basically just forcibly including people from countries all over the world. So I mean, there is a link between xenophobia and democracy, but it's not intrinsic, it's not essential, and like I said, people are turning off. People are turning away from the idea of a militarized border.
Oh, absolutely they are, and I think you're completely right when it comes to if you look at the polling data, it's extremely it's not well accepted whatsoever, and I think you make a great point regarding when Barack Obama was in office. I think there were some people who were much more willing to go along with the government and what they wanted to do regarding immigration, and it didn't quite get the pushback that it gets when it comes out of the mouth of Donald Trump for a series of very reasonable.
Well, and that is a problem.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's a problem, right? If you are fine with if you're fine with anti-immigrant sentiment because it's coming out of the mouth of a Democrat, then you don't have any principles.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I argue that point on a regular basis. And I actually think Michael Moore, for better or for worse, I think sometimes he can get a little bit too in love with celebrity. But in his latest documentary, he does go after Barack Obama quite hard, specifically when it comes to what happened in Flint, Michigan, the rerouting of the water that led to the murder of hundreds, if not thousands of people, and of course the lead poisoning that is still going on to this day, and Barack Obama siding with the governor, Schneiderman, I believe his name was. I think he's a criminal. That is really abhorrent stuff. But I want to talk to you a little bit about messaging and how I wonder if you're encouraged or discouraged based on, it just seems to me what we're living in this Trump era. People have now, it's been normalized to a degree that I was hoping it wouldn't quite get normalized. I think people are still like, this is weird, but not quite to the extent that I think they should be in many ways. What about just consistent messaging coming from government, coming from leadership, and how that does seem to work? We're doing a 3-parter on Joseph Mengele on last podcast on the left, so obviously talking a lot about the rise of the Nazis and things like that. And I'm not equating the two, I'm just simply talking about how political messaging seems to work. What are your thoughts on how vulnerable or easily manipulated the human mind can be when it comes to democracy?
Oh my God, it's an epic question. I mean, it is troubling what people accept, but that is the history of the United States,
Right.
and the fact that we live in a country where plenty of horrible things have been perfectly legal, from slavery through segregation, through the treatment of wives was literally the property of husbands who could do with their spouses what they wanted, including rape them and beat them. So I mean, it's like, common sense. I guess, for me, the optimistic reading of this is like, okay, common sense can change, and what's acceptable can change dramatically, even in a generation. And I see some of the normalization of Trump as also just symptomatic of the American political system, which is a winner-take-all, first-past-the-post two-party system. And so what happens, is that, people, they stuck to the party. They stuck to,
right.
They didn't want to break with the Republican Party. And so it's like, that's a feature of our political reality. And it's
right.
a major problem because what it did is it changed the common sense for so many people who are part of that coalition.
Right.
And, perhaps one of the answers is that then we have to think about the structure of our democracy, right? Other ways that politics could be arranged so that doesn't happen. I mean, if we had a system with multiple parties and proportional representation, then maybe there would be this sort of fringe white supremacist party, but it wouldn't actually be able to take over one of the only two,
right.
Political entities. So I think there is something very scary happening, and it's the kind of compromises that people will make to keep power. It is also a resistance to change. I think we are seeing something very powerful in nostalgia, right? In this idea, like sort of going back to a past that never really existed,
right? That
was more, patriarchal, and where older white people ruled the day. But it's a complicated question. I think
right.
Your point is like democracy is not always pretty, and that is
right.
one real theme of this film is that. So I go back to Plato and I go back to the Republic, which is the foundational text of Western philosophy, and it's an anti-democratic text. And Plato says, and this is expressed very beautifully by this Greek philosopher, this woman, and we're actually sitting in the site of Plato's Academy, and she says, Plato warned that democracy would devolve into tyranny because of wealth inequality. So the divide between the rich and the poor, and that the unruly passion of the people would lead them to elect a tyrant. And what Plato feared most of all about democracy was that it marginalized the wise, right? And he thought that because, of course, the Athenian democracy put his mentor Socrates to death. And so, these warnings about democracy, have always been there. But the thing is, so Plato offered his medicine, which is this crazy idea that there should be these philosopher kings. And, what's interesting is he said they could be men and women. He was actually kind of, I wouldn't say he was a feminist, but he was for gender equality on that front.
Okay.
But, what we've never done is sort of equalize, get rid of this problem of the divide between the rich and the poor, which is what Plato
right.
said was the source of the problem. And we don't do that because the forces of oligarchy, like the rich, the capitalists, call them whatever, are basically willing to go to whatever length, to maintain their wealth and their power, even if
right.
it risks bringing the entire world down.
Yeah.
And destroying the climate. So, but democracy is a risky enterprise because it encourages people to question the legitimacy of the political system, and that can be a very powerful thing because it can lead towards justice and more inclusion. It can be a very dangerous thing.
Right. Hey there, want a New Year's resolution you can actually keep? Stop going to the post office to send letters and packages when you don't have to. Hey, that sounds pretty fun. Save time and money this year by using Stamps.com instead. Stamps.com brings all of the amazing services of the U.S. Postal Service right to your computer. That's exciting. Stamps.com is the fast and more convenient way to get postage. Simply use your computer to print official U.S. postage for any letter, any package, any class of mail, anywhere you want to send. And the mail carrier picks it up. No more lugging mail to the post office and no more hassles. We use Stamps.com here at the studio and we couldn't go without it. When you're as busy as we are, Stamps.com makes it easy for us to make the most of our time and money to make sure you all get your last podcast shirts, pins, patches, and puppy bandanas right away. I use Stamps.com because when sending letters and packages is this easy, this reliable, and this efficient, why would you use anything else? I love Stamps.com. And right now, you too can enjoy the Stamps.com service with a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus postage and a digital scale. So start the new year off right. Go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in Top Hat. That's Stamps.com, enter Top Hat. Well, and it's interesting because obviously with the Democratic field, I think there's going to be it's going to be a vast field, I hope, for the Democratic Party, and I want to hear your thoughts on that. Sort of harkening back to what we saw in 2016 with the Republicans, and obviously, you talk about people being able to toe the party line in order to maintain power. Lindsey Graham, to me, is just the personification of someone who went completely spineless, no backbone at all, just towed the party line after, of course, what Donald Trump said about his best friend, John McCain, and, all the things that happened on the campaign trail with giving out Lindsey Graham's phone number and all that madness, and Lindsey Graham still supports him to this day. But when it comes to the Democratic Party, we're going to have someone like an Elizabeth Warren out there. And then perhaps Michael Bloomberg might throw his name into the ring. Of course, a billionaire, former mayor here in New York. He was a fairly fine mayor, except for the illegal third term, but we don't need to get into all that right now. Are you excited to see any? Do you think that it's possible to move the needle when it comes to wealth inequality at like a federal level? Is it even possible with the powers that be, even with Elizabeth Warren? I mean, she's worth $10 million, and even her, it's just it doesn't seem like there's really any way to do it right now because of what you were talking about with the oligarchs that sort of rule things at this point.
Well, I think it's a really tricky task. I don't think we should underestimate it. I mean, so, on the one hand, I think there has been a massive shift in sort of, I wouldn't say common sense, but the way people feel empowered to talk about issues of economics and class publicly. We have the sort of, there is no alternative, Washington consensus of the 90s is gone. So there has been a shift on, and what actually seems possible is that finally positions that were actually always pretty popular, like taxing the rich, are now just being said aloud. So that's interesting. But I think we have to be realistic about the major structural obstacles. Even if somebody like Warren was the president, right, or Bernie Sanders was the president, they would be facing immense resistance. And this is a democratic dilemma as well. It's like you can't. Democracy is not just electing someone who has the same political views that you like and then expecting them to magically fix everything. That was part of the problem of the Obama era. So people were like, okay, this guy's going to hope and change everything for us. And he wasn't able to do that, right?
Well, I mean, once the person is elected, one of the ironies is that's when the work begins, both for that person and for the people that helped with that individual in power.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one basic lesson, that I wish, Americans would really accept is that it's when your team wins that you then actually engage in pressure techniques, right? Because those are the people you can move. You can march all day against the war in Iraq, like in 2003, the biggest, anti-war march in history. And there was not someone in office who was going to hear that. So I think we need to, the problem with this kind of sports team mentality is like, okay, my side won. I voted for Obama. It's like, no, well, that's actually who you have to engage now in a kind of adversarial relationship with. Yeah. So to make him do the thing.
I mean, hell, it's working for Donald Trump and Ann Coulter. Like literally, Ann Coulter and Sean Hannity, both people who I've met. And, it's bizarre to meet them. But they literally, they are following through with Donald Trump. They are like, no, bro, you can't bend on the wall. And he did. And then they're so
they give him shit every day.
Every day.
Right. Yeah, they do. I mean, and I think there's something about that. I mean, my film, there's a parallel story in the film about ancient Greece. And so this warning of the rich and the poor. But then there's modern Greece. So I look at the sovereign debt crisis, and then there was this massive referendum in Greece, and basically, the Greek people voted against austerity, and their political leadership through the party wasn't able to follow through and sort of betrayed the popular will. And I tell that story as a way of presenting just how steep the challenges are. So the progressives in Greece, they did everything that you are supposed to do. They organized. They had occupations. They built a political party. They went on strike. Their political party won. They took over the government. They had parliament, and they had, prime minister was on their side. And yet, because of, how powerful, bigger transnational forces were, and the power of markets and the fact that we're all
Right.
in this global economy meant that, they didn't even win after doing all of that. So it's a sad story, but it's also just to remind us that, right, we don't just elect, even if we do manage to put a Democrat in office, there's not going to be, Medicare for all overnight.
Right.
And so people have to be ready to build power from the base.
This has been an issue. This has been driving me crazy lately. When it comes to the binary choices that we have, oftentimes we talk about, same coin, two different sides, and there's mild differences in many ways. There could be a lot more differences. It's amazing what everyone seems to agree on in a lot of ways. But when it comes to, let's see what's going on right now regarding the Middle East, regarding Syria, a lot of people are upset that Donald Trump, he gets a lot of stuff wrong. But when it comes to pulling out troops, I'm like, we shouldn't have been there in the first place. I really don't have a problem with it. But now you turn on MSNBC, corporate media, and they're banging the drums. If we need to stay there because 4 Americans just got killed by ISIS. They're not gone. It's well, they wouldn't have been killed if they weren't there. It is so difficult as someone who wants to be principled, stand out against war, foreign intervention in many ways, when we have a process where it just seems to constantly shift, and now we have a left that seems to be more in favor of foreign intervention and in favor of institutions like the FBI or the CIA, COINTELPRO, the horrible things that the FBI has done historically. So, that just seems to be extremely frustrating as someone who wants to be more principled and holds, true to some kind of moral view. So what's the option for someone who is anti-intervention, who is also skeptical of our, institutions because they have done some extremely nefarious things both at home and abroad. And now we have this process where you can't even get because we have a Democratic Party that's trying to appeal right now to Bill Kristol. It's just driving me crazy.
Oh, I'm going to be on a panel with him in a couple weeks. So,
well, tell him I said hello. I'm sure he's a very nice man. I just don't, but that's what, when you look at Bill Clinton coming in the early 90s, he came in on criminal justice, but being a hawk, not on reform, on making it worse for the American people and monetizing human suffering more than ever. So I think that's why some people are just really frustrated right now.
Right. Well, I don't know if I have much to really, add to that. I think, again, it's this partisan politics, and
right.
Ultimately we are in a political system. It's winner take all, so it's either A or B. And, I'm not making this, it's Tweedledum or Tweedledee argument. I'm just saying that what this does is ultimately it's either, you have two teams to pick from. And so
right.
People are willing to, if they see that, siding with the national security state is going to give them an advantage, then, suddenly there's this total amnesia
right.
historically. And I think in the long run that's really dangerous. I
Yeah.
think it's a winning strategy, to be honest. I do think there's a way in which it just reinforces a kind of cynicism, right? Because it does just seem like these parties are out for themselves, and and ultimately they just want to win. So I think there will be sort of long-term kind of corrosive effects.
Right.
And, hopefully, and that's why I think it's important that we do see a new generation of political talent coming up that seems to be speaking in a different way, to be speaking more honestly, to have their allegiances not to the party structure itself, but to the community. I'm not against party structure. I'm not like, parties are always bad. It's really about the way the Democratic Party in the United States is set up. So, it's on the one hand, this really broad tent. Anyone can join it.
Right.
Just declare your membership. But what that means is that people who are registered Democrats actually don't have a lot of power because they're not paying membership dues or something, right? So that the party's accountable for the big donors. So there's this weird paradox where it's at once really open and capacious, but then there was the ultimate structure is loyal to the people who are writing the checks. And so, I can imagine party formations that I think are better. So I do think people need to organize themselves into parties and use that as leverage to push for change. But there's something about the American political system that is
Right.
uniquely fucked up.
Well, it is set up to move extremely, extremely slowly. And I have to say, they are doing a great job at that.
Yeah. Well, the Democratic Party, too, was built from the inside out. So it's different than a European-style labor party, which has its roots in labor movements and was working-class people organizing themselves to push for change, right, to push the center for change. Anyone who knows American history knows that, the Founding Fathers were against parties, they were against factions, and then, of course, parties formed. And then what those parties needed to do was to get people to vote for them. Right. So we have, it's part of understanding history. We have these parties that started in the center and just want people to vote. They don't really want them to be too involved, as opposed to, something that would be truly transformative, which is a party rooted in people power.
Right.
That's trying to change the system from the outside in.
Yeah. Again, the documentary, it's called What is Democracy? If you're in New York, it's playing at IFC. Highly recommend going to check it out. We're talking with Astra Taylor. Thank you so much for being on the show. Let's just talk a little bit more about the documentary specifically, what the process was like when you were putting this whole thing together. And do you just want to talk about how the hell do you go about an undertaking such as this documentary, because this question, what is democracy, is, it's just such a big one. Yeah, I never really paused to think about what a big undertaking it was. I think I just plowed ahead. But it was, as the end of the edit closed in, I struggled to get certain things right. In a film about democracy, you, of course, have to represent the people. Yeah. So the question is, how do you do that in a movie that's an hour and 45 minutes and make it feel, sort of vast enough and diverse enough, but not overwhelming and all over the place. So that was a real challenge. And I guess the interesting thing is going back to sort of what you were talking about earlier with like who's doing the counting, who are the people? Yeah. Who are the people that you were like, I want to represent? Yeah,
and so this is the thing. So there's sort of three threads in the film. So one is the United States and looking at the relationship between racial justice and economics, right? The fact that that this country was founded in slavery and that we haven't, this is a problem that is still really with us. So
right.
It touches on the civil rights movement, touches on Black Lives Matter, but in a philosophical mode. Again, in a philosophical mode. These are the sort of foundational issues. Then also, as I said, Greece, so going back to ancient Greece, but then also contemporary Greece and the economic crisis and the refugee crisis. And then there's a thread set in Siena, Italy, that's looking at this painting. And I chose Siena because it's actually the home of the world's oldest bank that's existed since 1472, right?
Oh, okay.
It was one of the centers where finance developed.
Okay.
So it stands in for the beginning of capitalism. There's a scene with this painting that is the first secular fresco called The Allegory of Good and Bad Government. And so what this does is it gives me, so through these channels, I'm able to explore the history of capitalism, the history of democracy,
right.
and, issues of race and xenophobia and the question of borders. And so the film has this very big scope. And so the people you see in it are, there are politicians, the former Prime Minister of Greece is in the film, there are philosophers like Cornel West, Sylvia Federici, Angela Davis, this wonderful political theorist, Wendy Brown. But then everyone, otherwise, what I tried to show was that the people who are experts in democracy, who we really need to be listening to, are people who know intimately what the problems are.
Right.
So I talked to refugees, I talked to immigrant workers in a factory, I talked to kids in a school that's really underserved, where they're basically, at the bottom of the social ladder. And
right.
I treat people like they're philosophers, and I ask them about justice, and I ask them about democracy, and I ask them about what they want to see in the world and what their lives are like. And so what you get a sense of is not just the people, but also a philosophical people wrestling with ideas and trying to figure out this question: what is democracy?
Right. Well, I'm interested to hear some of the responses from the children, because of course, because of wealth inequalities we've talked about. When it comes to education, that's where you really see it manifest itself, and that has a permanent effect on somebody's life if they don't go through. I know I was just reading a little bit about yourself, and you didn't go to school until you were 13, right?
Yeah, I was unschooled. I was raised in a very countercultural way, so I never had a bedtime. I never had an alarm bell. I was never told to do anything. I never got a grade. With total freedom.
Well, that sounds kind of fun. But when it comes to these children, I'm interested to hear, like, what were some of their views of democracy? Because certainly in many ways, democracy hasn't treated them right at this point.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the basic thing. I mean, there's almost this platitude, right, when you just talk to people about the problems that we face as a society, and they go, "Oh, the solution's education." And I really feel bad for teachers, for educators, because they're expected to do everything from like fix democracy to prepare students for jobs that actually don't exist because the economy is not under their control.
Yep.
And also fix students' psychological health and all of these we just put so much on their shoulders. So I applaud teachers on so many levels. But,
totally.
When I ask these kids based on like, do you have democracy in their school? I mean, the answer is like, duh, no. And they actually look at me like from a moment like, who is this crazy Canadian lady? Why is she here asking us this question? But then I dig a bit, and what you realize is that the point of the scene is that they are getting educated in democracy, and it's an anti-democratic curriculum. Because what happens, and I'm just going to give a spoiler, but these kids who are like 12, 13, they tell me that they wanted the lunch to be hot. They didn't care. They accepted the fact that food wasn't good, but the fact that it was cold was an indignity.
That is heartbreaking.
They just thought went too far, and they asked for warm food, and they were punished. And what I think what this scene shows, and then they talk about how power works. And they talk about, no, it's not the teachers. It's not even the administrators. The school is ruled by bigger people, bigger than us, bigger than our parents, bigger than the teachers.
Right.
They understand how power works, and they understand that democracy doesn't exist if you can't exercise your voice, if you can't ask for the basic things. And so it's a heartbreaking scene, but it's also, you see that they're so capable, that these kids are really astute. And one in particular is just like wonderfully eloquent. And so in that scene, I'm trying to show, hey, we are not honoring people's capacities.
Absolutely.
Right? There's something wrong with our society if these are the lessons that we're teaching kids, and there's no denying them. The kids are very upfront, right?
Right.
Because we're black and we're poor, and we get it already at 14. And you also see the fact that as they get older, there's two groups, and the older group is that much more beaten down. They're just like, I just need to grin and bear it. I cannot fight back. There's no point. And this is a parable about our world today. And the fact that we're in a society that, basically some people get on this escalator and get raced to the top, whether they're talented or not. And it typically has to do with how much wealth their parents have. And, it correlates with the color of their skin. And then a lot of people are sort of, kept on the bottom rungs. Maybe one or two will get out, and then we'll say, hey, we've got a meritocracy. That's what pulls up by the bootstraps. But
my God.
I think it's a really important one.
I know failing up is a real phenomenon.
Failing up is a real thing, man.
You see it in the entertainment industry on a regular basis, and you're like, how did that person get there? They're like, oh, that's right. Their mom or father was a producer and whatever. Anyway, but I don't want to be bitter. I'm not being bitter.
Yeah, no.
I'm not going to do that.
You can be a little bitter. You just got to bounce back. That's
exactly. You got to, there is still, our little network, we come not from much. And so you can still do it. You got to work hard. And but of course, it's just totally accurate, and it's so disheartening when people are really just totally they're not totally screwed, but let's be honest, it's just not going to be an easy road. And then when everyone, specifically when it comes to immigration, everyone's talking, go about it the right way, become a legal immigrant the right way, or legal citizen the right way. And it's like, well, you closed every frickin' door and you nailed every window shut. There is no right way. And technically, when someone does come over the border and seeks asylum, that's the right way. And you still demonize them. And, when it comes to education, I just don't, it's just so hard when you want to look at test scores and you want to say, well, I'm sorry you weren't able to get in because X, Y, and Z. The reason they couldn't get X, Y, and Z is because they were totally disadvantaged from the very beginning.
What do you know the history? Do you know the history of the word meritocracy?
No, I don't.
Yeah, so the word meritocracy is quite funny that this is this word that people kind of hold on to as an ideal. And so, if we are a meritocracy, then things are fair, or if we could be a meritocracy, things would be fair, because it was actually a term coined by this British writer and sociologist named Michael Young, and he wrote a satirical book, and it was a satire of a world where those with merit got to rule. And what he basically said was that this would be a terribly undemocratic world because people who had that advantage would then perpetuate it, right? They would do exactly what we're seeing today. So the irony is that this guy kind of wrote this very prescient book outlining the system we actually have today, only he was doing it to say, here's what it would be called, and it would be terrible.
Wow.
Right? Because the people on top would actually believe that they deserve it.
Wait, so our entire political philosophy is based off of satire?
Yeah, and the guy is still alive, and he's written a few things. Going, oh my God.
Well, now it makes more sense. Now it's actually all coming together for me.
Yeah.
That's amazing. When it comes to going, just really quick, when it comes to education and teachers, I just want to hear your thoughts. Obviously, we had the teacher strike out in L.A. Teachers are, as you mentioned, I think one of the most maligned, one of the groups of people that aren't paid enough. They're blamed for everything. Do you think there's something nefarious with the lack of proper education in this country? Do you think that there's something to people saying, keep them uneducated? That gives us a reason to have them stay down.
I mean, if you mean nefarious as in purposeful and evil, then yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a conspiracy. If you look at the history of education in this country, it is a saga of class conflict, basically. I mean, originally the children of the poor and working class weren't educated. They were child laborers, right? I mean, they worked in factories until very recently in human history, right? And then when child labor was finally outlawed, or even just the hours reduced, then elites were like, oh no, what are we going to do with these kids? So that was part of what propelled the push for public education. Of course, there were well-meaning reformers who recognized that public education is something that everyone deserves. And we shouldn't deny that history. It's just that there are multiple motivations happening, and there was a push for separate education tracks. Vocational education training for working people, and people were very explicit about their intentions. They basically said, we don't want folks to get educated and to get uppity. Somebody's got to work in the mines. Someone's got to, work in the fields.
Right.
And we don't want them thinking too much. And so these are, just read the history books. This is what education in America is about. And working people have always fought for more. I mean, you can go back and look at, people who worked in cigar factories used to pull their money and pay someone to read poetry to them or read a political philosophy. Workers, organized night schools. They organized new immigrants, on the Lower East Side of New York, like famously organized language classes and reading groups to elevate their minds, because they didn't want to just be, treated as bodies that couldn't think. So, this is not it's a very interesting history, and and I think the fight continues to this day. I think what's fundamentally the problem with American public education is the way that we fund schools through property taxes.
Right.
And that
Absolutely.
gives us a veneer of equality. It gives us a veneer of access for all. But the fact is that certain kids get a lot more money.
Yep.
Than others, and those kids are disproportionately black and brown. And until we address that, and I just think like equalized funding across the board, or based on the cost of living.
And there's tons of white kids out there living in poverty too, and because of that property tax rule, I mean, there's just so many crappy frickin' schools around this country. You drive through, if you've ever had the wonderful joy of driving through Indiana and just seeing what Gary, Indiana looks like, I mean, this country is devastated.
You have teachers literally doing fundraisers on the internet for basic supplies or for books, and we're the richest country.
It's crazy.
In the world. It's crazy. So I think education, I think it's a problem. I guess, we're getting to the end here, but, our society is very strange. We act like voting is a sacred ritual, and yet we make it impossible. We refuse to, make Election Day a national holiday or automatically register everybody. So there's okay, we say it's so important, but we make it so difficult. Education is the same way. We say, education is it's the key to success, and yet we have this system where teachers don't even have books. So there's such a gap between the ideal and how things actually are, and these are totally democratic problems, which is why democracy cannot just be electoral politics and voting. It has to be taking into consideration all of these other aspects of life
Right.
and the underlying economics and balance of power.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry for those listening. I rescheduled Astra Taylor like 1,000 times, and I would have said no to do my own interview. So thank you so much for being patient.
No worries. It's really fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Everyone, check out the movie, What is Democracy? Again, if you're in New York, it's at IFC right now. Thank you so much, Astra. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for listening. That was my interview with Astra Taylor. Check out her documentary, What is Democracy? Also, there's another documentary called Zirzek and Examined Life. So check out both of those. I mean, really awesome stuff. We got a lot of things to talk about here on the show coming up in the very near future. So we'll be covering everything. We got some new people. I want to talk about Julian Castro. I got some Bernie Sanders news. That is top secret, folks. It's top secret news. I don't know. It's not great, but it looks like there might be something dropping in June that could hurt Mr. Bernie Sanders. So we'll wait and see what happens there. Who knows? And well, I guess that's about it. Obviously, Roger Stone got indicted. There's a bunch of stuff to get to, but it's been kind of a crazy week here. So I hope that you just enjoyed the interview. And again, Kevin Barnett, we love you, buddy. Let your friends know you love them out there. And to anyone that came out to the Bell House show, the Lucas Bros put it on. It was great. It was me. Brought Holden and Marcus on stage. Hannibal Buress, Che was there. Obviously the Lucas Bros. We had a really nice time hanging out. So that was fun. So it was nice to see people at the Bell House. All right. So yes, we'll do more news stories. We got a lot of news to cover, but I'll do that on the episode coming out in like 4 days or something. So you can hold on. It'll all be coming out for you. All right, everyone. Love you. Hail yourselves. Talk to you soon.
This show is made possible by listeners like you. Thanks to our ad sponsors, you can support our shows by supporting them. For more shows like the one you just listened to, go to lastpodcastnetwork.com.